All right, Sublation media people, of which right at the moment there are none watching, but this is Pop the Left with Ashley Frawley and, of course, myself, Douglas Lane. Today we're going to be talking about how higher education has shifted from being about teaching people to have critical faculties and understanding and information to being focused on their mental health. And then we'll also talk about the death of the subject, maybe in the second half. But Ashley, welcome to Twitch and to Pop the Left. So how are you today?
I'm great. I'm sorry for my disheveled appearance. I've literally just come back from the gym. So sorry.
You know, when really attractive people apologize for their looks, it irritates people like me. So stop it. And I'll cut that part out, but for Twitch, that's live. There, people will see that. So yeah, tell me about your monograph. You've been working on it for a while. You sent me some excerpts from it, some chapters. And what is the title of your next book, and what is it all about?
So this book is called Significant Emotions. And it focuses on the rise of emotions, and in particular, so-called positive emotions or positive sort of emotional orientations as panaceas for social problems. And I first conceived of this book, I think, about 2016, just after my first book came out, because I started to notice that it wasn't just, my first book was on happiness. And I started to notice that it wasn't just that happiness had emerged as this social issue, as a problem in itself, and as a supposed solution to a wide range of social problems. It was starting to change. Even as I published that book, I noticed that the language of happiness was shifting to the language of well-being, and the language of well-being was shifting to the language of mental health. And I had also realized that prior movements, like the self-esteem movement, had kind of given way to the happiness movement in a number of ways. So I really wanted to investigate how and why that was happening, that even as one discourse is criticized and begins to fall away, and people stop really championing it as this cause and solution to a wide range of social issues, there's always another one waiting in the wings. There's always something else waiting to come up. And I wanted to try to explain that. First of all, I wanted to describe how that happened and some of the process through which that happens. And then I wanted to understand what underlies that. So that's what this book is about.
So you said that, there had been earlier movements that fell away, like the self-esteem movement. And it's become now a mental health movement, but wouldn't mental health kind of be a broad category and self-esteem be like a subcategory of that?
Yeah. So what I thought was initially going on was that it was just these kinds of cycles. And I sort of conceived of it. Initially, I published a few short papers and book chapters about this in edited volumes. And I had conceived of it as a kind of cycle. But as I got more into it, I realized that they are not cycles. Then it's not just history repeating itself in each iteration. So what I'm talking about are basically therapeutic fads. And, mental health seems like an umbrella term, and in many ways it is an umbrella term. It's not something that's just come up out of nowhere. In fact, it has its heyday much earlier. But the way that they come into the forefront of the public imagination and begin to, be on the tip of everyone's tongues, that's their faddish kind of nature. And so although mental health has been around for a long time and it's this kind of umbrella term, the way that, for instance, I noticed around 2014, all of my students were suddenly passionate about mental health, all of them, like uniformly passionate about mental health, which I found very interesting. It seemed to come almost out of nowhere. And I think they were passionate about mental health in a way that students probably wouldn't have said they were passionate about the happiness movement. They would have felt a bit silly saying something like that. So I think as these discourses, they come to the forefront of the public imagination, but they fall away because they have some or they give way to a new idiom because they have something about them that doesn't quite work. So like the self-esteem movement fell victim to the criticism that it's too individualized, it's too individual oriented. And actually the problem is that people have too much self-esteem. There's lots of people who just have too much self-esteem. What we should really be concerned about is happiness. And happiness is Aristotle's understanding of eudaimonia and so on. But happiness sounded a little bit frivolous. So they were always kind of shifting to new keywords. They would say, well, what I'm really talking about is subjective well-being. And subjective well-being had a rhetorical advantage over happiness in that it had a kind of a ring to it, a scientific ring to it. It sounded like it had it sounded more removed from everyday life. So if you had like a policymaker saying, I'm here to make you happy, people say, it had a dystopian kind of feel to it. But if they said, we're here for the promotion of subjective well-being and we are talking to our experts in this, then they would say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Whereas if you say, oh, we're talking to our experts in happiness, again, it doesn't sit well. And then I'm oversimplifying hugely because that's not the only reason why these things come up. I mean, my 2015 book was a detailed exploration of just the happiness movement, but this is one part of it. And then well-being gave way to the language of mental health, which was more expansive because in each one of these iterations, what people will do when they take up the discourse is they will stretch it. They will try to expand it to encompass a wider array of everyday concerns and social issues. And mental health is kind of ideal for that. And in addition, there was already a huge network of people in a wide range of institutions that were positioned to take up a renewed discourse of mental health. So a lot of people who had been interested in well-being, they started to talk about well-being and mental health, well-being and mental health. So it was happiness and well-being, and then it became well-being and mental health. And then that became kind of this huge discourse and buzzword, even though it had already existed. There are movements in the past to politicize mental health. And actually, if you look at Google Ngram, which is I don't know if anyone's ever played around with it, but it's just a listing of all of the texts that Google indexes. And you can see mental hygiene, which is an older kind of discourse, which is very similar in a lot of ways, actually. As it falls away, because the mental hygiene movement was associated with eugenics, as it falls away, you can see mental health kind of rises up. And it became a different way of talking about kind of similar issues. So it became this renewed thing, the more expansive. Mental health was something that, affected everybody. It's not just people who are ill. It followed a similar trajectory to health, where health gradually stopped being about, it's just something that you have when you're not dying. It became something you have to consciously pursue. So mental health became, again, something that has to be consciously pursued. So each one of these discourses is connected in interesting ways. Now, as I said, I've greatly oversimplified the process through which this happens, but they're connected to each other and they give way to one to the other, and each one has something over the other that kind of allows it to be used by more people to fill more institutional gaps. And also they're not just all telling the same story over and over and over again, which I thought was interesting, because initially that's what I thought they were doing. I thought it was just the same kind of story about social problems. Now I'm speaking a little bit like people know who I am and what I'm my research and that kind of thing. But the whole idea of my first book was that happiness became this way of individualizing very deep contradictions within capitalism. It did lots and lots of things, but that was one of the things that I claimed was happening, that I found particularly interesting, this area called happiness economics. And I thought, well, why would economists be so interested in telling you that money doesn't make you happy? But of course, your employer is very interested in telling you that money doesn't make you happy. But also there's this stagnation within capitalism that needed to be explained and harmonized. And so what they were doing is they were saying, well, look, like, maybe we don't need growth anymore. Maybe economic growth doesn't make you happy. Maybe we should pursue happiness instead, that kind of thing. So I thought that it was just this way of individualizing social problems and kind of deflecting responsibility for social issues back onto the subject, onto the individual. But actually, I realized that in each one, there's more pessimism. Because as an explanation for social problems, what emotions do is they say the reason why things go wrong is because of some weakness within the human subject. When I say emotions, I mean emotion discourses. What they frequently do is they say, well, like people actually said this. They're like, oh, maybe we wouldn't have the 2008 financial crisis if people didn't seek happiness through money and houses they couldn't afford and stuff like that. So it's like, mainstream economics has this idea that this whole monster exists because we demand it in the market, right? So we make mistakes subjectively by demanding the wrong things. So you can kind of change people's behaviors and get them to demand the right things, and then you can solve all kinds of problems. But what I noticed over time is there's this growing kind of pessimism that in each iteration of this kind of the problem of positive emotion, people become more and more pessimistic about the ability of change at the individual level to actually solve issues. So if you look at the self-esteem movement, they would say, like, oh, if you believe in yourself, you can do anything. And if we just change the way people feel about themselves, they're not going to have premarital sex, they're not going to have, they're not going to get pregnant when they're too young, they're going to get involved in violent crime and gangs and all these sorts of things. At least there was this sense that if we do this, we will shore up the individual to not have these problems. It was wrong because that wasn't the cause of problems, but at least there was this kernel of optimism. As you move along, the promises get more and more measured. So with mindfulness, you had this kind of magic bullet side to mindfulness, which was similar to the self-esteem movement. But at the same time, they would say, well, it's not a magic bullet. And it's not a solution to all problems. They were very careful about saying that. Whereas in the self-esteem movement, they literally said, this is a social vaccine. If we give people self-esteem, we will vaccinate them from future social problems. The happiness movement, again, Martin Seligman said, this will inoculate people. You use the language of inoculation in his 2002 book. It will inoculate people from future issues if we teach them the true meaning of happiness when they're children, and teach them to pursue happiness correctly. Mindfulness, you get more of a measured, you still have some of that. This whole first promote X, then somehow, some way, this problem's going to be solved. But Jon Kabat-Zinn, the kind of guru of the mindfulness movement, says that the goal is to feel at home in the maelstrom. And so you start to see this with these discourse. And one discourse that I don't look at, but other people do, is resilience. And it's a similar kind of thing, that it's about shoring up the individual to be resilient to a world beyond control. And I think this really reaches its apex in the mental health movement, where you can well imagine it being like this earlier self-esteem discourse, like, oh, if we make people mentally healthy and we promote mental health, then they're not going to have these problems, they're going to get good jobs, and they're going to be rich. No, they don't say that. At least not in the discourse that I'm looking at. It's more like, why do we need to look at mental health? Because the world is so messed up and there's nothing we can do about it, basically. Well, so it becomes more and more pessimistic.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. I'm interrupting this interview to tell you about Gcas and a seminar that's coming up with Christopher Hedges and Boris Franklin. This seminar, which will include the book Our Class Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison by Chris Hedges, and the play Caged, written by the New Jersey Prison Theater Cooperative, will examine the transformative power of education and creative self-expression in prison. Again, that starts on May 2nd. It's the first session. Gcas is our only sponsor on this channel, and them stepping forward to help us out by being a sponsor made a big difference as we came together to create Sublation Media. So I would appreciate it, if you're interested in what they're doing, for you to check them out. I'll put a link to Gcas in the description of this video and in the show notes for the podcast, and you can take a look at not just this seminar, but what they're doing overall in the coming year. I want to take a look at the kind of overall milieu this is happening within, because I don't doubt that you could trace a kind of pessimism through all these movements, as you just did. But one of the things about the whole terrain, and I'm going to call it therapy culture, but perhaps I could just call it psychology, is that it kind of has a pessimistic starting point. And I'll just start with a personal anecdote. Like I started therapy recently. Had stuff happen that made me decide I could try that out, and it would be worthwhile. And I'm going to like a therapist who has psychoanalytic training. He's not a psychoanalyst, but he is, educated in psychoanalysis. And he tells me that Freud believed that the range of mental states or psychological conditions ran from neurotic to psychotic, basically. There's no category of sanity or no like undisturbed category of subjectivity within a therapeutic context, but rather like the aim is to help patients cope with the disturbance that just really is being human.
Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, this is fine. Like it's justifiable within like a therapeutic context or psychoanalytic context. There are dangers to it because it can become like it can replace religion, I think, for people or other kind of meaning making systems. But do you think this problematizing of human subjectivity, which is, certainly it's basic to Freudian thought, is unjustified overall, or is it just unjustified in the context of setting policy on like university campuses or within states? Or how do you think of the whole realm of psychology and its presuppositions?
Well, I'm not really critiquing the whole realm of psychology. In fact, some of the best critical theorists come from psychology, come from within the discipline. It's more the public use of these kinds of discourses and the way that they become institutionalized and mobilized by policymakers and used within understandings of broader social issues. And I think actually this desire to, this kind of pessimism about the individual, pessimism about humanity, I mean, obviously it has lots of different roots. The
Mm-hmm.
20th century did us no favors in this respect, right? I mean,
Right,
you want to be pessimistic, just look at what happened. and
right.
and people, just look at the Second World War, the Holocaust. This is what happens when human beings try to control history. That's the lesson that we took from that. But the
Mm-hmm.
pessimism goes back further as well. You can see, like, at the very origins of sociology, not just psychology, sociology, is
Mm-hmm.
in this. Well, it's, when I call it pessimism, it depends, because it's not just wholly pessimistic or wholly optimistic. There is, like, even though people are pessimistic about human nature, they do have a side where they think that at least there's a side to some of these discourses where, like, well, human beings can be reformed, and the solution is to just reform human beings. Now, what I think happens is that over time, as the problems persist, if your underlying ideology or your underlying way of understanding problems is human frailty, and you try to develop some kind of intervention to fix people, but the problem carries on. If you don't question your underlying understanding, you will question continually human nature. You will just say, well, God, it's obviously because it's just human nature. Human beings simply are beyond repair. And you become more and more pessimistic about human beings. And I think that's partially what happens with some of these discourses, that over time, because people are so convinced, it's just so ingrained, I think, in our culture. You ask anybody,
Mm-hmm.
well, why this issue? Oh, well, it's just human nature. So if the issue
Mm-hmm.
continues on, it just must mean, no matter what we do, it just must mean it's because human beings are just fundamentally sick and weak. Instead of thinking, like, well, hey, maybe it's something about our system in which human beings are living at the moment that tends to reproduce these problems and makes them wicked issues and insoluble within the current framework, for example, of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of it, if you go all the way back, the optimism that followed the French Revolution was really quite short-lived. So there's this idea that, like, well, human beings, we can kind of, we're capable of reason, because we have reason, we're capable of freedom and the free exercise. No, not all human beings, right? But there's this kind of this idea that at least some human beings are capable of self-governance and all that sort of thing, which is quite radical for its time. And then almost immediately you had this kind of reaction and this pessimism that came in, and this like return to nature, and this idea of like human beings are going too far within the sort of romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. And so you had these two kinds of force, and there's one force that came out of that, which was socialism and communism, particularly that influenced by Marx, which was, but not just influenced by Marx. It was 1848 influenced by Marx and Engels, right? But he's not like like leading everything. But so there were these kinds of movements that said, well, no, look, the reason why we don't see these ideals coming to fruition within society is because we need to have another revolution. We need to overthrow the vestiges of feudalism. We need to overthrow this new system that gives us a false sense of equality in order to, fully realize these kinds of these promises, the ability of human beings to self-determine and that kind of thing. And then that got pretty well destroyed. And the 20th century obviously just drove the last nails in the coffin, and so all that's left is this kind of pessimism. But you can see that almost immediately. It was like, well, the French Revolution promised liberty, equality, fraternity. When people looked out into the world, they saw the opposite. And you could explain that in a number of different ways. But one of the ways that people explained it at the time was, well, human difference. Well, why aren't all human beings? Why don't we see equality in the world? Well, because human beings are unequal. White people are different than black people, and women are just different than men, and that's why. And they've just naturalized these things. And then, in its harsh forms, that became race realism and scientific racism, which attempted to explain all of the inequalities in society on genetic bases, or not genetic at the time, but on the basis of human difference ingrained in our biology. And then its kind orientation, it was culture. We have cultural differences, and that's actually quite a good thing. We should celebrate that, and so on. And these were all parts of what was the right wing early on after the French Revolution's kind of obsession with human difference and culture, and later the biologization of these kinds of differences. And it was the left that was saying, no, we have to move forward. We have to keep moving in order to fully realize these things. They are realizable. The human subject is an open subject. We're not determined in advance. With the death of these kinds of movements, the only explanation that's left is human difference, really. And so you have, I think, the more that you attempt to solve problems at the individual level, the more that you fail, the more pessimistic you become.
Well, let's talk about higher education, because this is you've sent me a chapter about the change in the aims of universities, and this is taking place in the context of this overall spiraling pessimism. And you wrote that there's been a perceptible and general shift away from the more liberal ideas and ideals that we were just talking about, that might be aligned with Marx, but are certainly aligned with the Enlightenment project. And this idea that higher education is a broadly public good, toward a more personalized and commercialized. It's basically higher education being personalized and commercialized, and to benefit individual students. And you said this shift toward more individualized and commercialized goals has fostered the movement of therapeutic ideals into the heart of higher education. So I'm wondering, how do you see the individualizing and commercializing of society, maybe broadly, but higher education particularly, leading to the introduction of therapeutic ideals into education?
Well, to be clear, the role of the university in society has been subject to a lot of debate, and different purposes have been put forward at different times. And so it's not just like, that's what the university was about. Now it's about this. There's a lot of debate about that. So the bit that you're quoting from is just a bit of literature, not just, it's some literature review about debates about the historical role and purpose of higher education. But generally, I think there has been a shift from slightly more liberal ideals associated with education toward more personalized commercial ideals. But that it's not like, again, it's not wholly, this is just what the university is about, because higher education still just like education in general, gets a lot of social problems kind of shunted onto it. So the responsibility for social issues becomes the role of the university. Beyond simply giving an education, you have to deal with broader social inequalities. Deal with the shift away from industrialization. There's all sorts of agendas that get
One way that the university is tasked with solving social problems is by being a gatekeeper towards the professions.
Yeah.
And therefore a site for a need for diversification in the student body in order to create equality, at least amongst the professional classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's like an example of what they're tasked with doing. But I guess another example would be they're tasked with protecting the students from mental illness that might be caused by the university itself.
Well, yeah, not just by the university, but by the broader problems of society, which I think is interesting because over time you can kind of see that it's like, oh well, uncertain job prospects, and a life of debt and all of these things. These are problems for which therapeutic solutions are needed. It's not even like I'm going to solve this by making sure you get a good job. It's like, no, the job market's terrible. You're not going to get a good job. Ergo, you need this kind of these kinds of therapeutic solutions. Now, there's a long, I don't want to be boring, sorry, but there's
Do
a
not be
long kind
boring.
of complicated history to how mental health made its way onto the agenda. So it's not, it's.
Well, tell me about that. I mean, tell me about how it became mental health that on the agenda in
So
higher
initially,
education.
mental health made its way onto the agenda. Really, you could go back to the beginning of the 20th century with the mental hygiene movement. And the mental hygiene movement made its way into universities through people who made claims that this sort of unseen problem of mental hygiene among young people was the cause of all sorts of later social problems. And like crazy connections were made. Things like, well, assassinating. We wouldn't have people assassinating prime ministers if we had just did something about mental hygiene and that kind of thing. And there were some successful claims that, for instance, if we took care of mental hygiene in university, then you would have a stronger military base. So you would be able to draw on conscripts that would be good, to make good soldiers. And this kind of fed into the broader concern with the health of the population, because you want a healthy population to draw them up to go to war for you. So these kinds of claims were very powerful. The very first ones, anyway, that kind of drew on these broader broader governmental concerns. But over time, more and more people began to sort of join in and say, oh, like, well, I have something also to offer to mental hygiene, and that's going to solve these sorts of problems. And there's this quote from a 1930s text where it was like, over time, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker all competed with each other to claim that they were the ones to have dominion over the mind of young people, the mental well-being of young people.
I've just been told I have a fly on my head. I don't see it.
Anyway, so there was a lot.
You don't see a fly on my head, do you?
No, I don't see it. Maybe you have a fly on your screen, viewer, and
yeah, that could be. And also, if you're saying my fly is down, you can't see that. So it happens to be the case, but that you can't tell. All right, enough. Sorry,
I feel
this is the
you're
problem
so
with.
privileged because now you have access to the comments of people, and I don't.
Well, you can see them if you click on there's a comment button in the corner.
Oh.
You can see them, but I can throw them on the screen.
Okay.
I
You know what?
shouldn't even look at them,
To
but
be fair,
okay.
I just took one look and I thought, I actually do not want to see that.
Right, I know, right? It's distracting, but Jean says
Anyways,
I'm
okay, so then
saying.
they
All right.
had these mental hygiene is institutionalized at the beginning of the 20th century. So already they were institutional sites. And when you have institutional sites, a new discourse, you have people who are in place who are hungry for a new discourse, because they always have to renew their claims to the validity of their existence. They would say, oh, there's a big problem we're trying to solve. In fact, it's bigger than you imagine. We need more funding to survive. And I'm not just around mental health or self-esteem or whatever. This is a very common thing that happens when a discourse is institutionalized. It creates a site within an institution. So new ideas are always going to go into that hub. And that's how they kind of gain a foothold. Mm-hmm. So this is what happened. And they gradually became counseling services over time. So you had these counseling services, and then they start to organize into broad national networks. And so you have fixed lobbying organizations with an interest in ensuring that there's always attention to this. And in the 1990s, they, in the UK at least, they took hold of some legislation that had come through at that time to argue that universities had a duty of care to students, and in particular students with disabilities, which they interpreted to mean also mental health issues, to protect their mental health, lest they fail in their duty of care, and this left them open to being sued. So what these claims makers did was they drew upon the university, the higher education sector, as a community of fate. So whatever happens, if something bad happens to the whole sector, or to one institution, it affects the whole sector, because it's like, oh, well, universities are failing their duty of care. They don't care about students, blah, blah, blah. This is quite bad for them. So universities were really on board right away in the 1990s about this idea of like doing more, spending more on counseling, spending more on mental health. And then these organizations, there was this concern going into the early 2000s that it was too top down, that it was within the institution, you had the VCs were all on board with more counseling services. I remember, I think it was like quite early on when I started at Swansea, I remember sitting in one of these like big meetings, because I was leading this thing for the college. So I had to go to like a VC's meeting with all the big shots, and they were like, oh, we just need to let go of this idea that the university is about knowledge. It's not about knowledge. It's about well-being. And I was really shocked by that. And I was sitting there, I was like, you really got the idea that they thought the university would be a great place, if not for all these pesky academics who just ruin everything. Like, it's just like a holding area for young people. We like mold them into like citizens.
So is every class would be a therapy session? Is that basically what it would be?
I thought it was because like learning difficult things, it's difficult. And if you have like really high and tough academic standards, that's hard to live up to. And students might drop out, that kind of thing. And that's bad for the institution because they want money. And also it looks bad on league tables if you have too many students dropping out. So they are really interested in student retention. And they have like the last little bits of an interest in maintaining academic standards, obviously, because it's bad for the sector. But the incentive is to give high grades and not to push people, because if you do, you're going to push them out of the institution. It looks bad on you. You lose money. It's not a good thing. So these groups, they kind of drew on that, and they got the institutions on board really early on. And then they started to, claims makers, I think a really key moment came when they sought out like a bottom-up kind of approach. So they really encouraged young people in the universities to take hold of this discourse and to set up their own groups. And they universities spent a lot of money kind of funding these sorts of things. At the same time, there were
student organizations, right?
Yeah, student organizations. And so there were some student organizations whose main goal was to go around the UK, getting other universities to set up student mental health organizations.
And they would get funding from the university.
Yeah, to do that. And not just from the university, but from also special interest groups, trusts, charitable trusts, all sorts of claims makers with an interest in keeping that, in lobbying around this particular issue. Now, of course, like a lot of the young people who got involved, they did so because it gave them a sense of meaning and purpose. And you can see that across a lot of the discourse. And some of the people that we interviewed as part of another project connected to this one, that you didn't really see like a lot of success stories in the sense of people like no longer having mental health issues. Success stories were people who made mental health into their mission and their purpose and their job. So that for a lot of these young people, they went on to become leaders in organizations around student mental health as well.
Mm.
But the university had a dual interest in encouraging students to be involved in mental health. One, they were concerned that if the lobby groups, the counseling lobby groups, their interest was just in pushing up as much funding as possible for professional counseling. But it's expensive. It's quite expensive to have like enough counselors on staff, and they were really lobbying hard to ensure that they would say like, no problem, no matter how small, take it to the mental health services, take it to counseling. And they really problematized the idea that students would rely on their own networks and their friends and their families when they had problems. Right. They were like, no, if you do this, it's going to fester and it can become a problem. Anyway, so they were really lobbying hard to ensure that students accessed the services that were there. And the universities were concerned that if this got out of control, they wouldn't be able, it would just be not cost effective. Now, I think the more powerful ones were quite happy to keep investing in it because they were, through regulatory capture, they would push their competitors to overinvest where they could afford it, right? And then they could advertise, oh, we have all this investment in counseling and professional counselors. Anyway, so what they wanted to do is they wanted to utilize peer support, so student mental health first aid training and things like that, to get young people kind of involved in giving mental health support, because obviously it's more cost effective, but also it spreads the risk out. And they wanted to spread the risk across basically the institution, it seems to me anyway. I don't think they consciously wanted to like, oh, we got to spread this risk. It's just they knew that they had in their hands a lot of risk if students, for example, commit suicide. It looks really bad on the institution. And so they wanted to ensure that like anybody around these students also were taking responsibility. Like if someone was having issues, an academic should pick it up, but everybody's kind of shirking this risk off because nobody wants it. It's one of the interesting things that I found in the interviews was like risk was a big issue for people that were involved in these initiatives, especially academics. They were like, I don't think the university knows the kind of risk that we're holding, because if I miss an email and I'm supposed to be responsible for this, then I'm responsible if something goes wrong, something really bad goes wrong. And the university doesn't want that either. So there's a whole part of this story as well that is around risk management. But anyways, getting students involved is a really big part of it. And they got a lot of support. That trustees were members of these counseling services, overarching bodies. So there was a lot of connection between these lobby groups and these claims makers and the students. And then this big moment came when they started to work with the National Union of Students, who put together this survey, a series of surveys in 2013, starting in 2013, that claimed very, very, very high rates of mental ill health among students. And that really is what put it on the agenda.
Well, when you talk about risk management, it makes me think about when I worked at a physician's answering service. I think the medical industry overall right now, actually, it's funny that the university should be similar to the medical industry, but it tries to mitigate risk. And when I worked at a physician's answering service, one of the things that was emphasized was that we were not qualified to assess the risk of the call or the severity of the call or whether it was an emergency or not. And that was all shoved onto the patient themselves. So if they called up and said, I'm having chest pains and I'm seeing spots and I can't stand up, we would say, do you consider that to be an emergency?
Yeah.
So,
and it's interesting because they'll shirk the risk onto the NHS. So, there's this explosion of all kinds of things ostensibly for mental health. But if it's like, oh, but for severe mental health problems, you go to the NHS. And the NHS is like, no. For severe mental health problems, you go to the university. Nobody wants to actually deal with these sorts of things, partially because they probably can't. Like there are certain things that, their treatments don't have high rates of efficacy. It's quite complicated. It's very expensive. So they're just kind of pushing these problems back and forth onto each other.
Right. They drum up an interest in the university as a way to handle and get mental illness and to achieve mental hygiene. And then, of course, they can't actually fulfill their own promises there. So
No,
they
they actually create additional issues as well, and that's part of it, right? Because they recast a huge range of human emotion as a mental health problem. So that's how they managed to claim enormous rates of mental ill health. Was they asked these questions on surveys where it was like literally any negative emotion whatsoever was defined as mental distress. And then in their claims making, they would often, even in the survey, in the results of the survey when they released it to the press, they went back and forth between, like, they would say, to the student, they would ask, have you experienced any of these in the last year or something like that? And then in the discussion, they would talk about symptoms. Students had experienced these symptoms instead of feelings, right? And literally any negative feeling was listed, which is amazing. So 92% of students had experienced a range of negative feelings, ranging from like I can't remember, like severe depression to like feeling down in the past year. I don't know, maybe I'm weird, but like I feel down monthly.
Really? That's all?
Well, being a woman, that's what happens.
Oh, I see. I gotcha.
The idea that 8% of people don't feel down monthly, or didn't feel down at all for the past year, I found really amazing, actually.
Right. Yeah.
So they managed to, by eliding a huge range of human emotion with like negative symptoms of mental distress, implying that these were medical things, they created very high rates of mental ill health. And what's interesting about it is that it appeared to be a kind of a predetermined conclusion, because in the press release for the 2013 survey, they did ask a question that was based on diagnosis initially. They asked, have you been diagnosed with a mental health condition, or are you seeking diagnosis, or do you think you have one? And that produced a result of 20% of students, which is just ever so slightly lower than the rate in the general population for the same age group. So they actually did ask that. And then they produced this 92% figure of like symptoms of mental distress.
Right.
And then the next survey, they did away with that, because I imagine that 20% figure was probably pretty disappointing, because it was less than the general population. But in the press release for that 2013 survey, they had all of these claims makers from mental health organizations saying, well, we know that university is bad for mental health. We know that it's a huge risk factor. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? Even in your like self-report study, which we know self-report studies tend to overestimate, even that produced a lower figure than the general population. So they assumed that the university was a pressure cooker. And it's the same thing with the claims that eventually came up around suicide. And so it was like this epidemic of suicides and so on. Actually, it's about half the rate in the general population for the same age group. So alternative headlines could have been, go to university, it'll halve your risk for suicide.
Right.
But once you have these kinds of lobby groups in place, they're in a position to frame these kinds of statistics in the form of claims for more spending, more intervention, and so on. And that's so they have an interest in expanding the purview of mental health to include all these sorts of things. And what I started out saying was that they've kind of created an issue there, because now young people will have been told, like, it is your responsibility as a good citizen to like be constantly thinking about your mental state and to be looking for signs of illness, which is negative kinds of feelings, and to go to a professional. But when they do that, they can't. So they are told they can't and should not rely on themselves or their networks, that's quite bad and dangerous. Literally, that's the most common claim across the sample that I looked at in the media was you have to seek professional help. But then when they do, they can't. And then, of course, but this then becomes fuel for more claims about more spending, and the university kind of tries to push back. And that's kind of the situation that we're in at the moment.
So other than
sorry, I'm so sorry. I meant to say the situation we're in at the moment, where we are trying to embed now mental health in the institution and change the role of the institution. However, it's not, I don't want to overstate it. It's not like a huge thing. Like, now this is the role of the institution, but they're trying more and more to embed it in the institution as a way of kind of trying to push back against this ever escalating claim for more and more and more and more spending and more intervention. So then this has a gradual effect on the curriculum and on our delivery and on what we do around deadlines, all these sorts of things. So that's how it starts to have an effect on the role of the university.
If we step back from the claims that are being made, in other words, if we don't take it seriously that this really has anything to do with trying to create mental hygiene or health or self-esteem or happiness, and we just say, ultimately, institutionally, maybe not in terms of people's perceptions, but institutionally, that's not what's going on. What is how is it functional for universities to be transformed in this way? And, I would think that you would want a highly educated, competent, knowledgeable citizenry in order to have your economy function, in order to, like you said earlier, have good soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
to have employees that could follow instructions, and so on. And if everyone who shows up to work is worried that they're about to have a mental health crisis or a breakdown, that's going to be dysfunctional for society at large. So, how is it functional for the institution to take that role, do you think?
Well, for one thing, I mean, the people who graduate with this kind of new forms of emotional knowledge and emotion commodities, really, and these new emotion skills are in demand in a huge range of institutions. Like I feel like a lot of the therapeutic culture and the therapeutic industries just sort of sop up an excess of university graduates, and they become regulators of other people's emotions. And the second thing is that one thing that people often argue is that what these discourses do is they create ideal neoliberal subjects who self-govern and don't call on expensive supports and so on. So obviously that's not what's going on here, because they're being instructed expressly to call on
Mm-hmm.
expensive supports, and also told that they cannot self-govern.
Mm-hmm.
But part of what I think is going on is that they offer kind of regulatory framework for everyday life, and it creates people who think it is, or ideally it would create, I'm not saying it actually does, but ideally it would create a citizen who constantly is looking for a regulatory framework. It's not that they're capable of self-governing, they just have it, they know what to do, and they self-govern and they behave in the right ways. They're always looking for rules about how to deal with their emotions. So a lot of like how it resolves within the university is like embedding in the curriculum. It's like, oh, you have all of these skills that you can use, and when you have a bad day you can do this, you can breathe in this way, and you can scream
Right.
into a pillow
So,
and go
like,
on.
everyone's getting cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah. And
Reframe your thoughts, reframe your emotions, and so that you can cope better with everyday life. But
mhm.
on the other hand, you can't do that. You have to go to a therapist in order to be trained properly, anyhow.
And you can't
But
really, you're never cured, right? It's like a constant thing. It's like it's becomes part of your life course, that's what you do. And in university you seek out these supports, and then when you go to work you seek out these supports, and you're always, it's not like all of the idea we have in our culture and sort of therapeutic culture is we have this sense that we're supposed to, it's good to like emote and express your emotions freely, and bottling them up is bad for you. But it's not just like any emotion should be expressed freely. You should
Mhm.
express the emotion so that you can then bring it back to a script that you're supposed to follow. So like it's not like, oh, we love, like therapeutic culture doesn't love emotion, doesn't like it doesn't like anger, for example, unless it's
Mhm.
like righteous anger directed at particular sources. So it's always, you're always invited to bring your emotions back to a particular script. And a lot of
Mhm.
what people do, a lot of the people that we spoke to, which I found surprising, was they basically develop these scripts. They develop like regulatory frameworks for everyday life. And it's not just like in the area of emotion that this happens. Um, so I was talking to a colleague at another university, and he was saying that he had worked in, and I had kind of similar experiences or observations, but he'd worked in employability, developing these employability modules, so classes in how to be employable.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to teach these classes too, and I thought they were all right because I saw it as my role to like bring young people into adulthood, and to teach them how to get on in the workplace, and like
Mm-hmm.
they had a work placement, and it was like just gradually bringing people into the world of adults. I thought that was quite good. And then I left this behind. And some years later, I went back and I was talking to this. I went to this conference about these people who all work in this area, and he was saying to me that he had started an employability module with a placement, and over time, he gave it to someone else. Over time, what happened was students now source their own placements, and what the university gives is a framework where they go and do their placement, which they source themselves, they found themselves, and then they have to write about their experiences by reflecting on their feelings, this sort of thing, within like these employability skills and attributes of the good professional, and they just have to basically follow this framework that's given. And so the university doesn't actually even give anything, which I thought that was great, like unique kind of placements. That was our selling point, and I was still selling this stuff, and I think we still do it, but gradually we are starting to move toward that kind of
Explain that to me again,
self-source
because I think
placement.
I'm missing a step here. So the original, when you talk about placement, you mean that you were helping, the instructors were helping students find places to apply for jobs and be placed in
Sorry,
employment,
I'm
or
using UK terminology, and also I'm trying to avoid throwing my own university under the bus.
Mhm.
So, so I was being a bit cagey about it. So essentially, a placement is work experience.
Mhm.
So universities will develop, and this is what we do at Swansea, we develop relationships with employers in the community, voluntary and charitable organizations, a huge range of potential employers
Mhm.
for our social science graduates. And so each year, they will take a certain number of students. And so what I would do is I would prepare the students who never having like professional graduate level employment before. We'd do like a little boot camp to prepare them, and then they would do a 10-week placement. And we would source these placements for them.
So they would have a job for 10 weeks
10 weeks, yeah.
with one of these employers. And then after
So
that,
they
they
would get
could,
credit in the university. It was a class, so they would get
right.
20 credits for that.
And then after that, they could use those skills on a resume and maybe get hired somewhere else, or even get hired by one of these places that took
Yeah, and
them
they would
on.
develop all sorts of contacts. We had lots of great success stories. Students would
Mhm.
get jobs at these places
But
afterward, and
what you're telling it is that later on, no, you didn't get that relationship set up by the university. You had to go out and find it
you had to
yourself.
find it yourself.
You just were be given like some material to use to evaluate how you were doing
Yeah.
on your own.
Yeah, we still have these relationships at the university, thank God. But what I was shocked by, but we are sort of moving toward that as well. We encourage students to self-source, which is fine. But I
Mhm.
saw that in other universities, the move now is totally to self-source because it's a lot of work. Like we had to hire someone full time just to source placements, source employers, because you have to keep the relationships fresh. You have to go in and do health and safety stuff. It's a
Mhm.
lot of work, and it's expensive. And so what
Mhm.
the university will do gradually is they stop providing the service, the thing that you actually
Mhm.
want from the institution,
But they'll
and instead
provide you
the framework.
an emotional therapeutic framework by
No,
which
it's
to
not
judge.
even, this is just another example. I mean, the
Okay.
emotional aspect is that it's supposed to be reflective and all this stuff, but it's just another example of how the university will big itself up, the institute, like the sector will big itself up as being able to do something because they're huge, they got lots of money and resources, they're going to give you all these, they've got all these connections, they're going to give
Mhm.
you unique opportunities, and then when you get there, you do it yourself, and they give you a framework. And there are people
Mhm.
whose job it is just write these stupid frameworks. And that's what happened gradually, I think, with some of these therapeutic things. It's the same kind of it's a very common thing within the regulatory state or regulatory capitalism, that the state is supposed to be like this big thing that can do all this stuff, mobilize resources, lots of money, get a canal dug. And increasingly they retract that, they move away from that, and instead they provide a guide work and a framework for what someone else will do. um, and interestingly, like this, the institution doesn't get any smaller. You just have more and more people writing up these frameworks, and they
Mhm.
do less and less.
Hmm. So, huh. That I feel like we could spend an entire episode just on that
Yeah,
question,
it's really
on that
interesting. If
topic.
anyone's interested,
Yeah.
there's a whole area of research on regulatory capitalism and that,
Mhm.
starting with Thatcherism in the 80s.
Starting regulatory capitalism, starting with Thatcher. See,
Yeah.
that's like counterintuitive, right? The whole
Mm.
idea of Thatcherism is it was deregulatory,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but
Eh,
actually it increased regulation,
right.
and the size of the state increased as well in some ways. It's just the role of the state changes from actually doing something to providing all sorts of frameworks and regulations for how other people will do things. If you want an interesting example of this, there's a good paper by Lee Jones and I can't remember the first name of the second author, something, apologies, Hamari, but on COVID-19 and the failure of the regulatory state, where you probably have heard that the United States and the UK ranked very highly on pandemic preparedness before the pandemic. So someone put together a really good PowerPoint, a really good report, which is actually really common, I think, in institutions. You have people who are just so good at making plans for what other people will do, and they get their promotions, they move on, and they go up, 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 up in management, and they leave behind freaking devastation in their wake because people are like, I got to execute this plan, but I don't have the resources to do it. But someone said that I was going to do it, and this is what happened, I think, with COVID
You know what
19.
I'm reminded of is safety committees
Yeah, yeah.
on the job. So you're supposed to have like live up to a certain regulation and standard for safety on the job, and instead of having someone like the employer or somebody who's assigned the task and given a budget and renovating, say, you're given you get a pool of employees to go join the safety committee, and their job is to go around the workspace looking for safety violations and writing them up, right,
Mm,
and then turning that in. And then I think that's the end of the road. I don't think anything actually, like, there's no budget for it. So if like you find a paper cutter that has no guard, well, note that.
mm,
you know the safety committee knows about it, but that doesn't change anything. um
mhm.
um
So yeah,
Anyhow.
the people who basically they direct who's going to pull levers, and the levers aren't attached to anything would be like a good
Right,
metaphor
yeah.
for it. Yeah.
Right. um yeah, but it gives the impression that something is being done. um and it does take up time. um well, so I mean, this is going to lead to my last question. It's like it seems like quite a lot of what goes on in the name of mental hygiene or mental health or self-esteem or what was the other one, mindfulness, um, is, you know detrimental to the extent that it gets people to spend time and money to move levers that don't attach to anything,
Hmm.
right? But does it do more than that? Is it actually damaging in some way? I guess because the resources are being misdirected, it's damaging. But is it creating? Are we now more vulnerable than we would have if we hadn't tried to deal with our mental health issues in the university?
I think probably at its worst, it encourages excessive self-attention. And I always use this example, but I remember what it was like in university, and I was like young and confused, like, and it was a difficult time. It was legitimately very difficult. But what's interesting is that I remember I saw in some of the early articles that I was looking at, early like newspaper discourses, people like student groups were trying to say like the NUS had teamed up with like a schizophrenia lobby group for some reason, and the schizophrenia lobby group was trying to say that schizophrenia is like super widespread in universities. They've probably done something with the numbers where they kind of redefined it in more loose terms. They often do that to create bigger numbers, just trying to raise
Mm,
awareness, that kind of thing. And the university doctors, as they were called at the time, said, "We're like, no, the problems that you have at university are situational, and they tend to pass afterward." And now the idea that you would say that is just crazy. That
mhm.
this is a hard time, and it's the best of times, it's the worst of times.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what being young is about. And instead, you kind of are encouraged to really put a lot of weight on that. And I think I remember this was starting even when I was younger,
Mm-hmm.
university. I remember that I started to kind of imbibe this discourse, and I do remember thinking, like, I will never get over these issues until I can find a professional to help me. And what
Mm-hmm.
snapped me out of that, and like I had a very difficult upbringing, and I had like it was hard for me also to like self-regulate because I didn't have parents or anything from a very young age. And so I had lots of difficulties, like serious legitimate difficulties. And I started to kind of not rely on myself, and started to believe that I could not rely on myself, and that actually these problems that I had were not situational, were not understandable because of what I had been through, but were part of my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I could recognize why I wanted to believe that, because it was like, it's not you, it's your brain. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's not, and you're like, oh, it's not me, it's not my fault, it's not some shortcoming that I have. But actually, I found, what snapped me out of that, as I was saying, was, coming across this whole history of the development of these discourses, and where they come from and what they invite us to do, and that this is not the only way of understanding your life and your emotions and your relationships to other people and your relationships to the outer world. And when I stopped being so self-attuned, thinking about my emotions all the time, thinking about myself all the time, and I began to become involved in projects beyond myself, a lot of these problems dissipated.
Mm-hmm.
And also the idea that I actually could overcome them myself, and that it would be very hard, and I would often find it impossible, but that I could through
Mm-hmm.
my will. And I think that the danger is that we can disempower people by claiming that it is wrong, even dangerous, to rely on oneself and one's own networks, that you always need to be looking for some other to provide you guidance. I think that's the worst that could happen. On the other hand, like, I do recognize that uh, these kinds of informal relationships that we have are important, and they're falling away. And sometimes the mental health discourse encourages people to come to me, like as a lecturer, for example, to come to me and talk to me. Like, I don't have mental health training. I'm a human who has been through things myself, and I can talk to you. And we need to be able to reach out to people and have relationships, and to come out of a black hole of atomization and isolation, which we are increasingly finding ourselves in, which is not good for us just as human beings, because we're social beings. And so in that sense, it has been good. Like, I don't want to say this is all bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's not necessary to medicalize these sorts of things, but if it
Mm-hmm.
allows people to reach out to each other, that's good. But the problem is when it tells people that they shouldn't, that they shouldn't reach
Right.
out to each other, and that
Mm-hmm.
this is, when your friend comes to you with, I see this online. Someone comes to you with a problem, like, oh, I don't want to do the emotional labor. Like, that's not my job. Like, it has to be someone's job to.
The nice way to say that is not, I don't want to do the emotional labor. You're taxing me and you're hurting me, but that does get said. But the polite way to say it is, this is above my pay grade. I'm not qualified to help you.
But you
Let
don't
me
have
give
to
you a
be
phone number.
qualified to deal with somebody's, like, to deal with a friend. And the like, I don't know, maybe me and my friends were just crazy, but like, we had like serious,
I
like,
think that's the conclusion for this whole conversation, is that you and your friends were just crazy. Listen, we've been talking for an hour.
that was a
What
terrible place to leave it.
no, but for the second part, for the second half for patrons, which will be released later today, do you have time to stick around for like
Yeah, yeah.
30, 40 minutes? Why don't we just talk about like the death of the subject and this kind of more academic, and we'll of course we'll devolve into chitter chatter, I'm sure, but so people won't be bored. But I'm going to end it here. And we were on Twitch. We have 5 people watching, and we can say goodbye to all 5 of them now. I think that it's Gene and like 4 more of his sock
No, it's
puppets.
5 fans.
Okay, all right.